Rilke trembled in the cold, damp air of the planet's night, her slender frame barely a shadow against the rocks she huddled beside. She could feel the ground rumble, distant at first, then closer as the roars of the monsters echoed through the dark. Her heart pounded wildly, and her thoughts were consumed by confusion and fear. She hadn't done anything wrong, she kept telling herself. But here she was, left alone. Her kind had fled without a backward glance, abandoning her as some twisted sacrifice to keep the monsters at bay. She tried not to think about her family's last words to her, the clipped tones and distant expressions as they said goodbye. They hadn't told her the truth, about her being left behind, but she could feel it in their gestures, in the way they avoided her gaze. To them, she was simply unnecessary. Rilke closed her eyes, trying to remember moments of warmth and kindness, but they felt distant and unreachable, as if they'd happened to someone else. The night grew darker, and the sounds of the monsters became louder. She could almost sense their massive forms slithering and shifting through the undergrowth, waiting, biding their time. The noise grew louder still, the sound of claws scraping against the ground, filling her with a dread so deep it felt like it was pressing down on her very bones. In her world, survival was a merciless endeavor. She'd been taught that only the strong and valuable mattered, and yet here she was, left behind because she was either. Rilke swallowed hard, desperately pushing the panic down, remembering what little survival knowledge she had. The terrain was vast and unyielding, the rocks sharp and unforgiving. She'd find no shelter here, no place to hide from what lurked in the shadows. The creatures would sense her fear, she knew that much. They would relish it, play with her as if she were nothing more than a living toy. A faint light appeared in the distance, casting an eerie glow over the barren landscape. Rilke squinted, her heart racing with a flicker of hope before doubt snuffed it out. No one came to this forsaken place, not willingly, at least. It was either another creature, something alien and worse than the monsters, or, perhaps... No, it was foolish to hope. She shrank back against the rock, but her eyes stayed fixed on the light, unable to look away. The figure approached, moving slowly, almost cautiously, as if it, too, was wary of the monsters. It was tall, with a strange, upright gait, unlike any creature Rilke had ever seen. Its skin glowed faintly in the dark, a stark contrast to the surrounding shadows. As it drew closer, she saw its face, a peculiar mixture of sharp angles and softness. It was clearly different. Before she could register what was happening, the creature, or whatever it was, spotted her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as their gazes met. In that moment, the alien expression softened, and she could sense something she hadn't felt in a long time, a glimpse of compassion, perhaps. The figure didn't move aggressively, didn't advance with the calculated intent she was used to from her kind or from predators. Instead, she thought it was a he, crouched down a safe distance away, his eyes scanning her as if assessing whether she was a threat or in need of help. She'd never seen anything like it, a creature showing what seemed like genuine concern. It made her suspicious, unsure if it was some kind of trap. Yet he stayed there, simply watching, waiting, with a patience she didn't know beings could possess. Rilke's mind raced, torn between fleeing into the night where monsters waited and staying where the strange, glowing figure observed her silently. The choice felt like a gamble. But the figure didn't press, didn't force her to make a move. Slowly, almost against her will, she took a hesitant step toward him. The alien man seemed to understand her fear. He gestured toward himself, and then toward a small pack he carried, opening it slowly to show her he was no threat. From it, he pulled out a water canister and set it down, carefully backing away as he pushed it toward her. Rilke eyed the canister, unsure whether to trust him, unsure if this was a cruel trick. But the sound of the monsters edging closer propelled her into action. She reached for the canister, her hand trembling, lifting it to her lips and drinking greedily. The water was cold and refreshing, filling her with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in hours. She looked up at him, and for a brief moment she felt a sliver of something unexpected, relief. The man didn't speak her language, and she couldn't understand his, but somehow they communicated through gestures. He pointed to himself and made a sound. Mark! She stared, realizing it was his name. She didn't know why he would share it, why he would want her to know anything about him. But she tried to mimic the sound back to him. Mark? A faint smile crossed his face. She had never seen her kind smile like that before. It was unguarded, sincere, something beyond her understanding. He didn't ask her name, perhaps knowing she wouldn't give it. Instead, he nodded toward a rough path that seemed to lead away from the creature's lair. He gestured for her to follow, then turned and began walking. Roka felt the weight of a decision once more, but this time, it wasn't about survival, it was about trust. She glanced back toward the darkness, where the sounds of the monsters faded slightly, as if waiting for her to make the wrong choice. And then she looked at Mark's retreating figure. The glow from his equipment was faint but steady, a beacon she couldn't bring herself to ignore. She took a step forward, her heart pounding as she followed him into the unknown. Mark's footsteps were heavy as he trudged across the jagged, alien landscape, his gear weighed down by a mission that felt far less noble than it had started. He was supposed to be searching for resources, scouting new locations, but all he saw now was the wreckage of lost hope and fractured dreams. Each step seemed to echo back at him, amplifying the loneliness that had steadily crept in over the months. His thoughts drifted, a bitter reminder of the sacrifices he'd made, friends lost, a life shattered, all for what now seemed like a pointless mission in a desolate, unfriendly world. It had been months since Mark had made contact with anyone from his unit, not that he expected it anymore. When he first landed, he believed he was on a rescue mission, part of a larger plan, a critical piece in the human survival effort. But reality set in quickly. Resources were scarce, and survival meant a ruthless isolation he hadn't anticipated. What haunted him the most was that he hadn't been able to save those who'd once relied on him. People he cared about. People who needed him. He paused, feeling a tug of regret deep in his chest as he stared at the horizon, contemplating the irony of fighting for survival only to feel utterly alone. But then something unexpected caught his eye, movement, slight and hesitant. His first instinct was to pull out his weapon, every nerve alert as he scanned the area. But as he looked closer, he saw her, a slender, frightened alien girl, barely distinguishable against the landscape. She looked too young, too fragile, and the sheer terror in her eyes told him she was no threat. Mark hesitated, lowering his weapon. He'd seen aliens before, of course, but never this close, never in this kind of situation. This girl didn't carry herself like the hostile ones he'd fought. She seemed lost, her body curled in a defensive posture, and in that moment, Mark recognized something raw and real, an innocence, maybe even a helplessness that mirrored his own loneliness. His heart clenched as he realized she was just as isolated and vulnerable as he was, maybe more. Moving slowly to avoid scaring her, Mark put down his pack, carefully opening it to pull out the few supplies he had left. He motioned for her to come closer, offering her water. She flinched, uncertain, and he could see the conflict in her eyes. She was weighing her options, probably wondering if she could trust him. He could almost see her inner turmoil reflected in her wide eyes, the mixture of fear and hope, a silent plea she didn't even realize she was making. Mark's voice was steady, calm. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." He knew she didn't understand his words, but he hoped his tone would carry his intentions across the language barrier. She reached forward hesitantly, taking the canister with trembling hands. He watched as she drank, a sense of relief softening her face as she realized he wasn't a threat. For Mark, this simple act of giving was grounding. It reminded him of something he'd nearly forgotten, the urge to help, to be more than just another survivor in a hostile world. And in that moment, he felt a spark of purpose reignite within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know her story, didn't know why she was out here alone, but he didn't need to. She needed help, and he could offer it. He gestured to himself, patting his chest. "Mark," he said slowly, watching her reaction. She studied him, her face a mix of curiosity and guarded suspicion. After a pause, she mimicked the sound. "Mark?" Her voice was soft, almost delicate, as if she were testing the word, trying it on for the first time. Hearing his name spoken aloud felt like a strange kind of comfort. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He didn't expect her to share her name, not yet. She was still wary, still keeping her distance, and he respected that. She had no reason to trust him yet, no reason to believe that he was different from whatever other threats she'd encountered in her life. He pointed toward the rough terrain behind them, indicating the path he intended to take, hoping she'd understand. If she stayed here, she'd be an easy target for the predators he'd heard about in his briefings. He gestured for her to follow, then took a few steps forward, stopping to look back at her, waiting. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't come. She stood there, motionless, her eyes darting between him and the dark edges of the landscape behind her. But finally, as if making a decision she couldn't turn back from, she took a tentative step forward. He felt a small wave of relief and continued walking, hearing her footsteps hesitantly following behind. The silence between them was filled with unspoken questions, things they couldn't say but felt anyway. Mark didn't push her for answers, didn't try to pry into whatever history had brought her to this forsaken place. She'd tell him if she wanted to, if she felt safe enough. For now, he was content to let her follow, to keep her close and watch for any sign of the creatures that roamed these parts. As they walked, he tried to gauge her condition. She looked exhausted, her movements slow and weary, as if she hadn't rested in days. Mark reached into his pack again, pulling out a small food ration and offering it to her. She eyed it cautiously, clearly unfamiliar with its appearance. But hunger won out over caution, and she accepted it, nibbling slowly as they walked. He felt a strange satisfaction seeing her eat, a sense of purpose that felt almost foreign after all this time alone. Mark wasn't sure where this path would lead them or if he even had enough supplies to make it out of this place. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he didn't care about the destination. His focus had shifted, narrowed down to one singular goal, keeping this alien girl safe, making sure she had a chance to survive. There was something profoundly human about it, a drive to protect, to give her the security he himself had been stripped of. He found himself talking to her as they walked, even though he knew she didn't understand. "You're lucky, you know," he murmured softly, almost to himself. "Most people I knew didn't make it this far." He laughed quietly, a sad, ironic sound. "Guess you could say I'm stubborn." She glanced at him, puzzled, and he shook his head. "Never mind. Just stick close, okay?" He gestured to her again, motioning for her to keep up, his voice calm and reassuring. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a hint of trust in her expression, a slight softening of her posture, a brief flicker of gratitude. It was enough. It was all he needed to keep moving forward. In the silence that followed, Mark found a quiet resolve building within him. He couldn't change the past, couldn't bring back those he'd lost or undo the suffering he'd endured. But maybe, just maybe, he could protect this one life. Maybe he could give her something better than abandonment, better than fear. And so, they continued, two strangers bound by circumstance, each step taking them further away from the horrors that had defined their lives. Mark didn't know what lay ahead or how long they could keep this fragile alliance. But he knew he wouldn't let her face this world alone. Not as long as he had the strength to stand. Mark sensed the monsters approach before he heard them, an instinct he'd honed after months of evading hostile creatures on alien worlds. He didn't need to tell Rilke to stay alert. The change in her posture showed she was already on edge. She glanced at him, her eyes wide, darting to the dark horizon where ominous shapes moved in the distance, casting long, monstrous shadows that crept closer with each heartbeat. Taking a deep breath, Mark adjusted his stance, his hand hovering over his weapon as he gestured to Rilke, motioning her behind a cluster of rocks. She didn't hesitate this time. She followed his lead, crouching low and keeping her eyes on him, searching for reassurance or guidance. He held her gaze for a brief second, trying to convey that he was there, that he wouldn't let the monsters take her. Her nod was almost imperceptible, but he could see the shift in her demeanor, a determination that matched his own. They didn't have much time. The creature's footsteps grew louder, a sickening, uneven thud as they drew near, sniffing out their prey. Mark's mind raced through every survival tactic he knew, calculating their chances with grim precision. The odds were bad, terrible really. They were outnumbered, and his ammunition was running low. But turning back wasn't an option, and surrender wasn't in his nature. In one swift motion, Mark unhooked a small explosive from his belt, a last resort piece of gear he'd held onto for a moment exactly like this. He motioned to Rilke, showing her how it worked, making sure she understood to stay clear of its blast radius. She nodded, her expression resolute, and took a step back, watching him with a mixture of fear and hope. The creatures came into view, their grotesque forms shifting under the faint starlight, their eyes glinting with hunger. They were unlike anything he'd encountered before, massive, muscular beasts with sharp, protruding claws and eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. Mark gritted his teeth, steadying his breathing as he took aim. He had to keep them back, create a window for Rilke to escape if things went wrong. Without hesitation, he threw the explosive, its impact sending a shockwave that rippled through the air, disorienting the creatures and giving them a precious few seconds. The beasts staggered, some stumbling back, snarling in fury. Mark fired a few precise shots, each hit slowing them down, buying more time. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. They were relentless, pushing forward with a bloodlust that was impossible to match. Rilke watched, her eyes wide with both awe and horror as Mark fought, each movement calculated, each shot deliberate. She had never seen anyone, human or otherwise, face such overwhelming odds with so little hesitation. In her world, survival was solitary, self-preservation was absolute. And yet here was Mark, fighting not just for himself, but for her. The realization hit her hard, a wave of understanding that shifted something fundamental within her. Mark could feel the fatigue setting in, his muscles straining with each movement, but he couldn't afford to slow down. The monsters were relentless, their growls filling the air, their forms looming closer with each passing second. He glanced over his shoulder at Rilke, giving her a silent nod, as if to tell her that he would hold them off, that she needed to be ready to run if it came to that. She didn't move, her gaze locked on him, an unspoken promise forming between them that she would stay until the end. One of the beasts lunged, claws outstretched, its eyes fixed on Rilke as if sensing her vulnerability. Mark reacted instantly, positioning himself between her and the creature, his arm raised to block its path. He fired again, his movements precise and controlled, his focus unwavering. The creature staggered back, wounded but not defeated, its fury intensifying with each shot. The strain was taking its toll. Mark could feel the exhaustion creeping into his limbs, the ache in his muscles intensifying with each strike. But he couldn't afford to falter. Not now, not when Rilke's life depended on him. His vision blurred momentarily, but he forced himself to stay focused, pushing through the pain, driven by a determination he hadn't felt in years. The creatures circled, their tactics shifting, as if they were finally beginning to understand the threat he posed. They moved in coordinated bursts, each one testing his defenses, looking for weaknesses. Mark gritted his teeth, his mind racing as he anticipated their next move, adjusting his stance to block each attack. He was running out of ammunition, out of options, but he couldn't let them see his fear. Rilke's gaze never left him, her face a mixture of horror and admiration as she watched him fight. She had seen creatures battle before, seen the calculated brutality of survival, but this was different. Mark's movements were driven not by anger or aggression, but by something deeper, a fierce determination to protect, a refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. It was a kind of strength she had never known, a kind of courage that defied reason. Another beast lunged, its claws raking through the air, narrowly missing Mark as he dodged, rolling to the side and firing another shot. His breath came in short gasps, his vision narrowing as the fatigue threatened to overwhelm him. But he forced himself to keep going, to stay on his feet. He couldn't afford to think about the pain, couldn't afford to acknowledge the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. In a brief moment of respite, he turned to Rilke, his voice low and steady. "When I give the signal, you run." Don't look back. Just go. She stared at him, her eyes wide, as if trying to comprehend the weight of his words. But she didn't argue, didn't question his command. She nodded, her face set in a determination that mirrored his own. The creatures regrouped, their movements synchronized as they prepared for one final assault. Mark braced himself, his grip tightening on his weapon, his mind clear and focused. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. This was the endgame, the final stand he had prepared for since the moment he'd decided to protect her. With a deep breath, he raised his weapon, his stance steady, his gaze unwavering. The creatures charged, their roars filling the air, their claws outstretched as they closed in on him. He fired, each shot precise, each movement calculated, his body a blur of motion as he fought with everything he had left. Time seemed to slow, the sounds around him fading as he focused on his task, his mind quiet and clear. He could feel the weight of each decision, the significance of each movement, as he pushed himself beyond his limits, his resolve unbreakable. In the chaos, he glanced at Rilke one last time, his gaze conveying everything he couldn't say aloud, the trust, the determination, the silent promise that he would see her safe, no matter the cost. And then, with one final burst of strength, he unleashed his last defense, creating a gap between them and the monsters, a narrow escape route that she could use. Go! He shouted, his voice firm, leaving no room for hesitation. Rilke hesitated for a brief moment, her gaze lingering on him, a silent thank you in her eyes. And then, without a backward glance, she turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows as Mark held his ground, his final stand against the creatures who would not see another dawn. Mark's last shout still echoed in Rilke's ears as she ran, her steps quick and light, each one taking her farther from the fight raging behind her. She never heard such a command before, someone demanding her safety above their own. The alien concept pulsed within her, and each step away from Mark felt both like a betrayal and a gift. His voice, calm and resolute in the face of those monstrous creatures, lingered in her mind, as if etched onto her spirit, and even though she was terrified, she couldn't help but marvel at the strength it had taken to stand in their path. But survival instincts pulled her forward, guiding her feet as the noise of the clash slowly faded into silence. She kept moving, navigating the twisted, rocky terrain by instinct. Her senses screamed that the monsters were still close, lurking, but she knew that if they had a choice between a lone alien girl and a human who'd wounded them, they would go after the greater threat. That thought filled her with both relief and a dull ache she couldn't understand. In her world, she'd learned that no one sacrificed for others without reason, without gain. Finally, exhaustion caught up, forcing her to stop. She crouched down, her breathing ragged, eyes scanning the horizon, half expecting him to emerge from the shadows. But only silence greeted her, the barren landscape a harsh reminder of the choice Mark had made for her. She looked back the way she'd come, the weight of Mark's absence sinking in. A new understanding bloomed within her, heavy and difficult, as she realized he might not return, that he had chosen his fate knowingly, accepting it as a natural consequence of his decision to protect her. Taking in her surroundings, she saw something glinting near the rocks, a small piece of gear, something he'd left behind. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands, feeling the cold metal beneath her fingertips. It was a simple object, a human emblem of sorts, worn with use, something he'd likely carried for a long time. To her, it felt like a fragment of him, a reminder of the impossible courage he'd shown in those final moments. She slipped it into her belongings, keeping it close, as if it could somehow preserve the memory of his actions. She began walking, slower now, her mind filled with images of him, the strange human who had faced certain death not for himself, but for her. She didn't understand his reasons, but she felt compelled to carry this story with her, to make sense of it even if it took her entire life. Each step was an echo of his final act, a tribute to the strength and bravery he'd shown in a way that defied all she'd been taught about survival and sacrifice. As she neared the edge of the territory, a familiar sight met her eyes, the first signs of her kind's encampment, their shelters blending seamlessly into the rocky surroundings. She could see the familiar figures moving within, their stoic expressions and efficient movements a stark contrast to the raw courage and warmth she'd seen in Mark. She approached cautiously, not ready to share what had happened, not sure if she could explain even if she tried. They looked at her in surprise, some even with suspicion. She knew what they were thinking. How had she survived? Why had the monsters not claimed her as they'd expected? But Rilke said nothing, her eyes distant, her thoughts filled with memories of Mark's final stand. She walked among them, a lone survivor, carrying with her the weight of an experience that separated her from them in a way she couldn't yet articulate. In the days that followed, Rilke stayed quiet, but the questions from her people never ceased. They wanted to know how she'd escaped, how she'd survived against creatures that even their warriors feared. She met their inquiries with silence, not out of defiance, but because she couldn't reduce what had happened to mere words. The truth felt too complex, too sacred to be explained with the limited language of survival. But one night, as she sat alone, staring into the darkness, she felt compelled to speak. Not to explain, not to defend her survival, but to honor Mark's memory. In a low voice, she began to tell the story to those who would listen, sharing the details of his sacrifice, the unwavering strength he'd shown, and the way he had looked at her as if her life mattered more than his own. At first they listened with skepticism, some dismissing it as an exaggeration, a tale shaped by the trauma of survival. But as she continued, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering, something shifted. She spoke of his kindness, his bravery, and the way he had faced down the monsters without a trace of fear, fighting for someone he barely knew. The sincerity in her tone, the quiet conviction in her words, slowly broke through their disbelief, leaving a palpable silence. Her people listened, their expressions softening, some with hints of understanding, others with a quiet awe. For the first time, Rilke saw a glimmer of curiosity in their eyes, a willingness to entertain the possibility that strength could be more than sheer power, that survival could mean more than self-preservation. She realized then that she wasn't just sharing a memory, she was planting a seed, a new way of thinking that had been born from Mark's final act. Over time, the story spread, becoming something of a legend among her kind. Mark's name was spoken in reverent tones, his actions remembered as a rare display of courage that transcended species and survival instincts. Rilke found herself at the center of this story, not as a hero, but as a witness to a kind of bravery her people had never known. She carried his emblem with her always, a reminder of the human who had shown her that there was more to life than just survival. In the quiet moments, when she was alone, she would hold the emblem, feeling the weight of its meaning. She knew she could never repay him, could never fully understand why he had chosen to protect her. But she made a promise to herself, a vow that echoed the strength he'd shown her, that she would honor his memory by embodying the values he had fought for. She would live not just for herself, but for those who came after, for the possibility that his sacrifice had not been in vain. As the seasons passed, Rilke grew into a figure of quiet strength among her people, a symbol of resilience shaped not by the harsh teachings of her kind, but by the memory of a human's courage. She became a storyteller, sharing Mark's legacy with each new generation, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering as she recounted the tale of a human who had stood against monsters not because he had to, but because he chose to. In the end, Mark's sacrifice became more than a story. It became a part of her people's culture, a quiet but profound shift in how they understood strength and survival. And as she grew older, she realized that his legacy had become something far greater than a single act of bravery. It had become a beacon, a reminder that sometimes, the greatest battles were fought not for oneself, but for the lives of others.